Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful you chose to spend some of your very valuable time with me as I do a spoiler-free review of Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. I'm especially grateful that you clicked play after seeing the length of this video. I've been really meaning to cut back on the length of the book reviews, but this book just became such an instant favorite of mine that I did want to do a deep dive into it. Of course, it's a very long book, too. It's over 830 pages, which for some reason, some people find longer books intimidating. I really like long books when they are great books because they give me more time to sit in that world, to get to know the characters as they grow and develop, and just to enjoy the overall experience. So yes, I was quite happy that this was such a chonker. Now, the problem here I'm having is more of a physical problem. I've been very ill with gastroenterological issues over the past, well, more than 2 weeks now. I'm recording this on a Tuesday, and I thought I was finally making some positive progress over this past weekend, but I've taken a big step backwards again over the past couple days. So I have a lot to cover. I'm going to try to get through this. Please bear with me. I might start to fade or lose focus here, but I'll do my best. Let's get into it. Okay, the plan here is to do a brief look at the plot, go more into detail with the setting and then the characters, talk a bit about the writing and the humor in the book, and then finish off with some observations about life and words of wisdom that are covered in the book, as well as my final rating of the book. So, starting with the plot, as you know, I don't like to say much at all about plots for the sake of not spoiling anything. Lonesome Dove takes place in the late 1870s, and it follows two men in particular who used to be leaders of a group of Texas Rangers whose job was to basically clear out the Indians as well as the Mexicans from the general areas that they were involved with, and to generally make things safe for the white settlers who were coming into that area in the late 1870s. So when the book opens up, we have these two former Texas Rangers who have started a cattle company with a small group of about 3 to 4 other men. And people talk about the first 100 to 150 pages of the book as being very hard to get through. I guess a lot of people abandon the book before really getting into it because in those first, like I said, 100 to 150 pages, there's very little happening other than this small group of guys are sitting around their tiny little roofless ranch house drinking whiskey and talking, and then there's not much happening. It didn't bother me though, because I enjoyed that time kind of getting to know the characters, and I don't mind slow books as long as there's a reward at the end of it. So yes, the pace of that initial part of the book is quite slow, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot happening per se, but we are really getting to know the people in the story here. Even after that, for the rest of the 700 or so pages, it's not much more than a bunch of guys riding horses through the desert. That's kind of what the story amounts to. So, of course, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the midst of that, but as far as the overall plot, yes, we do become invested in what these characters are doing and in the outcomes of the events that they're experiencing, but a lot of it too is just about the setting, the atmosphere, the characters especially, and then the themes that the book covers, all of which I'm going to go into in more detail. I'm going to make a comparison that is potentially highly inaccurate because I've never read the novel Moby Dick, nor have I read any of George R.R. Martin's books. However, my overall feeling is that this book contains the general storyline of Moby Dick, with the Don Quixote and Sancho Panza as characters set within a Shakespearean tragedy that has been written by George R.R. Martin. I don't know if that makes any sense, but based on what I know about all the things I just mentioned, it does feel like kind of an amalgamation of all those things. Before diving into the details too, I'll also just add that this is honestly one of the funnier books I've ever read, which is weird because it's not a funny book. It is a tragic book. There's a lot of horrible stuff happening. Like I said with my comparison, I said it was written by George R.R. Martin, and part of that is the fact that you don't want to get too close to any of the characters in here, because Larry McMurtry here likes to kill off characters about as fast as Martin does. So yeah, it's a highly tragic book. There's a lot of really difficult things going on, and yet I found myself laughing out loud, literally laughing out loud, which is something I almost never do when I read books, at several points throughout the book. So there is a lot of humor in this book as well. But leaving that aside, let's dive more deeply into the setting of the book, because that's a big part of what makes this, and I think it's probably a big part of a lot of Western novels. Having said that, I've read really almost no Western novels in all of my reading history, because in part I think it's a really difficult time in history, and we're going to talk about some of that here. The setting here is obviously a time when the white Europeans have really started to take over the continent through disease and violence. They have all but wiped out the indigenous populations of these lands, and there's a lot of awful stuff going on. So the setting is a big part of what kind of constitutes the mood of the book. I think the most interesting thing that was said about the Indians in the book, and like I said, these guys are former Texas Rangers whose job was to go around basically killing Indians and Mexicans and rounding up bandits and thieves and so forth. But we have a character, well, we have the two main characters who were the leads, the heads of the Texas Rangers. We have Gus, or Augustus McCrae, and we have Captain Call. The two of them are talking about an Indian they knew named Black Beaver. And Captain Call says, "Remember Black Beaver, Gus?" he asked. "He'd know how far it was." "I remember him," Augustus said. "He was always a puzzle to me how such a short-legged Indian could cover so much ground." "He claimed to have been all the way from the Columbia to the Rio Grande," Call said. "That's knowing the country, I'd say." "Well, he was an Indian," Augustus said. "He didn't have to go along establishing law and order and making it safe for bankers and Sunday school teachers like we done. I guess that's why you're ready to head off to Montana. You want to help establish a few more banks." "That's aggravating," Call said. "I ain't a banker." "No, but you've done many a banker a good turn," Augustus said. "That's what we done, you know. Killed the dern Indians so they wouldn't bother the bankers." "They bothered more than bankers," Call said. "Yes, lawyers and doctors and newspapermen and drummers of every description," Augustus said. "Not to mention women and children," Call said. "Not to mention plain settlers." "Why, women and children and settlers are just cannon fodder for lawyers and bankers," Augustus said. "They're part of the scheme. After the Indians wipe out enough of them, you get your public outcry, and we go chouse the Indians out of the way. If they keep coming back, then the army takes over and chouses them worse. Finally, the army will manage to whip them down to where they can be squeezed onto some reservation, so the lawyers and bankers can come in and get civilization started. Every bank in Texas ought to pay us a commission for the work we done. If we hadn't done it, all the bankers would still be back in Georgia living on poke salad and turnip greens." "I don't know why you stuck with it, if that's the way you think," Call said. "You should have gone home and taught school." "Hell no," Augustus said. "I wanted to look at it before the bankers and lawyers get it." Some things never change. We still do all the hard work so that the bankers and lawyers can get rich. Later on, a younger member of their group, a teenager named Newt, is talking to Augustus and says, "Do you think we'll see Indians?" Newt asked. "You bet," Augustus said. "We might all get killed this afternoon for all I know. That's the wild for you. It's got its dangers, which is part of the beauty. Of course, the Indians have had this land forever. To them, it's precious because it's old. To us, it's exciting because it's new." And then finally, here's a little comment from a whiskey trader who says, "This whiskey hauling business has about petered out," he said one evening. "Indians kept the trade going. Now they've about got them all penned up down in these parts. I might go up north." So yeah, we're definitely at a time in history where the indigenous populations have all been, if not murdered, then kind of shoved off into reservations. Speaking of wiping out entire populations with the arrival of the Europeans, we move on to Buffalo, and the book does kind of emphasize a couple of times just what a different place the plains of the southwestern U.S. were when they were literally filled with buffalo. And we'll go back to another whiskey trader again who says, "Mainly Fowler talked of Indians for whom he had a pure hatred. He had been a buffalo hunter and had had many run-ins with them. When the buffalo ran out, he began to traffic in whiskey." So he's someone who got into whiskey trafficking because there were no more buffalo left. And we have Gus again, who's reminiscing about the days when buffalo just filled the plains. He remembered when he had first come to the high plains years before. For 2 days, he and Call and the rangers had ridden parallel to the great southern buffalo herd, hundreds of thousands of animals slowly grazing north. It had been difficult to sleep at night because the horses were nervous around so many animals, and the sounds of the herd were constant. They had ridden for nearly 100 miles and seldom been out of sight of buffalo. Of course, they had heard that the buffalo were being wiped out, but with the memory of the southern herd so vivid, they had hardly credited the news. Discussing it in Lonesome Dove, they had decided that the reports must be exaggerated. Thinned out, maybe, but not wiped out. Thus, the sight of the road of bones stretching over the prairie was a shock. Maybe roads of bones were all that was left. The thought gave the very emptiness of the plains a different feel. With those millions of animals gone, and the Indians mostly gone in their wake, the Great Plains were truly empty, unpeopled and ungrazed. Soon the whites would come, of course, but what he was seeing was a moment between, not the plains as they had been or as they would be, but a moment of true emptiness, with thousands of miles of grass resting unused, occupied only by remnants of the buffalo, the Indians, the hunters. Augustus thought they were crazed remnants mostly, like the old mountain man who worked night and day gathering bones to no purpose. It creates just such a heartbreaking picture, doesn't it? Especially when we have this kind of final description of the acres of buffalo bones that were left. Several times he saw small herds of buffalo and twice rode through valleys of bleached bones, placed where hunters had slaughtered several hundred animals at a time. So, yeah, it's just kind of hard to imagine first the plains being filled with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of buffalo, and then just being filled with piles of bones. Now, of course, this is an era where treatment of specific people was especially bad, even worse than it is today. So, like I said, it's the 1870s, which is not too long after the American Civil War, and obviously black people are not held as slaves anymore, but they're certainly not treated any better than slaves. And in fact, one of the white characters in the story here makes note of the fact that a black person is being treated normally, and it's quite remarkable that a black person is being treated just like a white person. This black person goes by the name Froglip, and it says, Froglip didn't say much. He was a black man, but Jake didn't notice anyone giving him many orders. Little Eddie Suggs cooked the supper, such as it was, while Froglip sat idle, not even chopping wood for the fire. He's amazed that there's a black man there who's not being given orders by the white folks. On the following page, they're drinking together, and in reference to Froglip, he says, they were passing a whiskey bottle around, and Froglip took his turn as if he were a white man. He's astonished that the black fellow is getting his share of the whiskey. So certainly a tough time for anybody who wasn't a white man specifically, because one thing the book really emphasizes is how difficult life was for the women of that time. Basically, any young unmarried women had very little recourse other than getting into prostitution as a way to support themselves. Yes, there were some kind of more middle-aged or older single women who were widowers and whose husbands had maybe set them up with something before they died, so they had something to work with, but it does kind of emphasize that throughout history, unfortunately, sex work has been an important option for the independence of women, but we do see it in this case. We have a young woman named Lorena, who is described as being an especially beautiful young woman who has gotten into prostitution in order to support herself. And this little incident happened kind of apart from her work. A man was offering her money, and it says the sight of the money made her feel tired. No matter what plans she made or how she tried to live, some man would always be looking at her and holding out money. We like to think that things are a lot different now, but when you see the way men look at and treat women a lot of the time, I don't think things have changed as much as really they should have. And someone like you or I probably sit here and think, well, we would definitely be very different. We would treat women with respect and do everything we could to ensure their equality. But here's another kind of thought that Lorena has. She had often seen July looking at Clara with helpless love in his eyes. She herself didn't care one way or the other about July Johnson, but the dumb quality of his love annoyed her. Many men had looked at her that way, and she was not flattered by it. They wanted to pretend, such men, that they were different, that she was different, and that what might happen between them would be different than it would ever be. They wanted to pretend that they wanted pretty dresses and smiles, when what they really wanted was for her to lay down under them. That was the real wish beneath all the pretty wishes men had. And when she was under them, they could look down and pretend something pretty was happening, but she would look up and only see a dumb face above her, strained, dishonest, and anything but pretty. And here's a wish that another young woman had. Though the fort was nothing much to see, it was a busy place with riders coming and going all the time. Watching them, Elmira wished she was a man so she could just buy a horse and ride away. The men let her alone, but they did look at her whenever she left her room. So, yes, just women just wishing they had the same freedom that the men had. And on a kind of similar note here, we have this kind of funny statement that, could definitely apply to people nowadays. More and more, it seemed Dietz was the one man in the outfit he could have a comfortable word with from time to time. Gus turned every word into an argument. The other men were easy to talk to, but they didn't know anything. If one stopped to think about it, it was depressing how little most men learned in their lifetimes. P.I. was a prime example. Though loyal and able and brave, P. had never displayed the slightest ability to learn from his experience, though his experience was considerable. Time and again he would walk up on the wrong side of a horse that was known to kick, and then look surprised when he got kicked. And you just see this so often, how few people seem to emotionally mature much beyond their high school years. I see a lot of middle-aged people who have similar mentalities to when they were teens. And then even in the areas where the white folks had civilized the country in their larger towns and whatnot, this is how the towns are described in the book. Dodge City was a shock to him, for almost every woman in it seems to be a whore, and almost every business a saloon. Gamblers were thick in the saloons, and he had never seen a place where as many people went armed. And then later on in a different city, then he borrowed a wagon and a team and a big scoop shovel from a drunken man at the hardware store. It struck him that the citizenry of Mile City seemed to drink liquor day and night. Half the town was drunk at dawn. So yeah, even these towns, people are just drunk out of their minds most of the day and night, which is a theme that when I study that era of history is pretty amazing, just how drunk everyone was all the time. Now, when you look at today, is it much different? Sure, there are a lot of people who do depend on alcohol to get through life, but we have a lot more options besides alcohol now because it's not acceptable to be at work drunk like a lot of these people were in that time. Nowadays, we got pills, painkillers, prescription and non-prescription medications. A lot of people are numbing themselves with one thing or another nowadays still. So it seems to be a common element in human history as far as I can tell. So yeah, in a nutshell, this setting is a difficult time in history to read about. Like I said, is one reason I think why I haven't read a lot of Westerns. I don't like to glorify that era of history because of all the horrors that were happening. And one thing that comes through is just how mind-numbingly boring life was for even these men in the outfit here. I mean, the grand total of any entertainment that they could do usually just included drinking whiskey, talking with each other, playing some cards, or if they were lucky enough to have a musician amongst them, hearing some music, or if they had some money, going and spending some time with a whore for a little while. I mean, just their lives. You read about, especially at the beginning of the book, when they're sitting around this ranch, all they're doing every evening is sitting around in the shade, passing around a whiskey jug and shooting the breeze, and that's what they're doing with their time, or at least with their leisure time. Even when we get to the journey part of the story, even then, every day in their journey is sitting from sunup to sundown on a horse, slowly watching the desert go by day after day after day. And it has this to say later in their journey. As the herd wound across the brown prairies toward the Platte, whoring became the only thing the men could talk about. Of course, they always liked to talk about it, but there had been sections of the drive where they occasionally mentioned other things: the weather, cards, the personalities of horses, trials and tribulations of the past. Once in a while, they might talk about their families, although that usually ended with everyone getting homesick. Though a popular subject, it was tricky to handle. But then as they are getting close to a town finally, all they can think about is visiting the whorehouse. And so, I'm glad I don't live during that era. Let's just say that. Now, besides the setting, I think a big part of this book is the characters and the character study of the various main and side characters within the story here. Continuing with some of the themes I was just talking about, it's interesting how when you see people these days, some folks like to go on about how men aren't men anymore. Where's the grit, the toughness of being masculine, and all this utter nonsense. And they might refer back to these Wild West days of when men were men. But the author, Larry McMurtry, certainly presents the men in this story in a way that makes them much like modern men, in that they are all so insecure, rather dull, not very motivated, not having much initiative, would rather just follow somebody else's direction, complain endlessly about their hardships. And yes, they are living very hard lives, much harder lives than we live nowadays, but who they are at their core is similar to a lot of us today, I think. And in fact, one thing that's interesting about the book is that with most of the characters, we don't see much of a character arc, a lot of growth happening. In fact, I think one of the points of the book is just how little people will change, and even in the midst of circumstances that try them. Now, there are, especially with one or two of the younger characters, there is some growth and progression of those characters, but we do see this kind of just stubbornly holding on to your own faults and not having that drive to really change. Now, one interesting thing that I did read is that Larry McMurtry based the two main characters, Gus and Captain Call, on Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, which is one reason why I mentioned them at the beginning of this review here. So now, loosely based, I should say. I mean, they're far from direct matches to those two characters, but I mean, I guess Captain Call can be compared to the Don Quixote character, and then Sancho Panza and Augustus have some similarities. But one thing I did walk away from this book is with pretty much a new all-time favorite character in fiction. He's definitely vying with the likes of Sam Gamgee from Lord of the Rings as my all-time favorite fictional character. Augustus here, or Gus, is somebody who just wants to be lazy. He wants to avoid all and any work as often as possible. All he wants to do is sit, drink whiskey, and shoot the breeze with anybody who will talk to him, to the point where he will constantly provoke arguments with the men around him just because he knows that that's the most effective way to get somebody to talk to him, is to say something they disagree with. Just like nowadays, if you want somebody to engage with you, you have to say something that makes them angry, pisses them off, that they want to correct, and that'll draw them into the conversation. So that tends to be Gus's main strategy, is to argue with people and then just have fun messing around with them. In sharp contrast to all these other dull men, he stands out as being just such a colorful, interesting character. And here are a few of his quotes that just really tickled me. But first of all, here's kind of how he thinks about himself. He's in the midst of this journey and he's thinking, none of what he has just done was sensible, yet he had to admit there was something about such follies that he liked. The sensible way, which he had pursued once or twice in his life, had always proved boring, usually within a few days. In his case, it had led to nothing much, just excessive drunkenness and reckless card playing. There was more enterprise in certain follies, it seems to him. So that's definitely the type of character he was. Now let's see some of his quotes. Right at the very beginning of the book, here's how the author describes Gus's evening routine. By the time the shade had reached the river, Augustus would have mellowed with the evening and be ready for some intelligent conversation, which usually involves talking to himself. Not long later, Gus is talking to Lorena and says, "I figured out something, Laurie," he said. "I figured out why you and me get along so well. You know more than you say, and I say more than I know. That means we're a perfect match, as long as we don't hang around one another more than an hour at a stretch." Much later in the book, Gus is talking to an infamous Indian and says what I thought was kind of one of the funniest things in the book. Actually, this and the next thing he says, I thought were both quite funny. And the Indian says, "I'm Blue Duck," he said. "I've heard of you, McCrae, but I didn't know you was so old." "Oh, I wasn't till lately," Augustus said. "I wasn't old till lately." And then later on, he's talking to another fellow who says to him, "Do you consider yourself normal then?" Will Barger asked. "Certainly," Augustus said. "I never met a soul in this world as normal as me." Oh man, that's pretty funny. Unfortunately for his partner in business, Captain Call is about as opposite a person as you can get from Gus. Call never likes to talk, doesn't even like hanging around people, seems to find himself thrust into the leadership position every single time, even though he wants nothing more than to be alone and doesn't want to be in charge of anybody. And he's just so driven to always be working every waking hour, has to be busy doing stuff. And so it's funny, the two of them together are just like oil and water, and yet somehow over the years they have worked together so perfectly. But even then, you can see whenever they try to have a conversation, just the frustration that Call has. And Call says, "Where do you reckon Jake will end up?" Call asked. "In a hole in the ground, like you and me," Augustus said. "I don't know why I ever ask you a question," Call said. So yeah, this dynamic between the two of them is such a fun part of the story. And when I think about it, the dynamic between Gus and literally everybody else in the story is a huge part of the entertainment and a lot of the reasons why I found myself laughing out loud throughout the book. Now this leads naturally into what I want to talk about, the writing. Now, Larry McMurtry's writing is just so perfect. It's so well done, stylized for the time, and yet sprinkled with so much humor throughout. For example, here's a brief character description as we're introduced to a new character named Jasper. "Hired on yet?" Jasper asked. He had a mustache no thicker than a shoestring, and a horse that was not much thicker than the mustache. Here's another kind of humorous bit of narration later on. He heard someone yelling, and he rode into a little clearing near the trail, only to discover that the reason there was a clearing was that a farmer had cut down the trees. Now the man was trying to get the clearing even clearer by pulling up the stumps, using a team of mules for the purpose. Now this farmer ends up being a woman who is widowed, who ends up actually being quite a funny character herself, because she has this to say to Roscoe, the character who ran into her clearing the clearing there. This farmer named Louisa says to Roscoe, "I meant to run off before Jim went and died," Louisa said. "If I had, I wouldn't have had to bury him. Jim was fat. I had to hitch a mule to him to drag him out of the house. Spent all day pulling up stumps and then had to work half the night planting a husband. How old are you getting to be?" The last question was the beginning of her trying to turn Roscoe into her next husband. And a bit later he says to her, "What was it you said?" he asked finally. "I said we ought to get married," Louisa said loudly. "What I like about you is you're quiet. Jim talked every second that he didn't have a whiskey bottle in his mouth. I got tired of listening. Also, you're skinny. If you don't last, you'll be easy to bury. I've buried enough husbands to take such things into account. What do you say?" And as the characters journey and cover mile after mile, they meet these kind of oddball characters who sprinkle in so much entertainment to the narrative. We have this fellow who is an insect hunter and studying insects, who, for the sake of time, I'll skip him. We have this Mexican who they end up taking on as a cook for their travels, and he's a fellow named Poe Campo, and Poe Campo smiled at Newt being the teenage boy that's with the group. Poe says, "If I tried to ride that donkey, it would stop and I'd never get there at all," Poe said. "Besides, I don't ride animals." "Why not?" P asked, amazed. "It's not civilized," the old man said. We're animals too. How would you like it if someone rode you? And then later on, Newt tells this strange fact to Gus, who replies in typical Gus fashion. Actually, it's P.I. that's telling Gus about this. The cook's got a donkey, only he don't ride it, P.I. remarked. He says it ain't civilized to ride animals. Why, the man's a philosopher, Augustus said. And then, of course, Call says, that's right, I just hired him to talk to you, Call said. It would free the rest of us, so maybe we could work. So, the characters in this book are just amazing, just so much fun. But in the midst of all this humor, all these great characters, all this extremely difficult and disturbing, a lot of the times, setting of the book, it is filled with these little snippets of observations about life and words of wisdom that I'd like to finish up with before getting into my rating. So we have a black fellow named Dietz who has befriended Newt, the young teenager in the group, and is trying to be supportive and a bit of a mentor to Newt. And it says, some of Newt's questions Dietz answered, and some he didn't. He didn't tell Newt all he knew. He didn't tell him that even when life seemed easy, it kept on getting harder. True story. And this one especially I can relate to. Talking about another character here. He felt apprehension so strongly that at one point it seemed to tighten his throat and nearly caused him to choke on a bite of cornbread. He felt he was being carried along through his life as a river might carry a chip. There seemed to be no way he could stop anything that was happening, although it all felt wrong. And that is the story of my last 10 years, where I've just felt like I've been in free fall without a parachute, and things are happening and I just got no control. So I relate to that, definitely. However, here's another character we run into who has managed to remarkably seize some control over his life in quite a astonishing way. Elmira is talking to a doctor and says, "You'll have to let me know what I owe," she said. But Patrick Arundel just shook his head. "I came here to get away from money," he said. "I did it too. I got away from it, and it ain't easy to get away from money." That's quite a remarkable thought. We live in a world where it would be next to impossible to get away from money unless you were somehow able to survive completely off-grid and on your own. And obviously the character here has done something similar, which he's saying even in that time, in the 1870s, that was a nearly impossible task. These next two quotes I liked a lot because they talk about something that irritates the heck out of me, which is that so many people, especially for some reason people who want to say hateful things, whine about free speech and how they're being censored and where's our free speech, why can't we have free speech? And I'll read this and get into that a little bit. Two cowboys are talking to each other. The first says, "If you ask my opinion, she was his downfall," Bert Borum volunteered. "You can keep your damn opinion to yourself if that's what you think," Dish said. Isn't that just right? What all these people crying about free speech are conflating is what they really want is consequences-free speech, not just the ability to say things, but the ability to say things without consequences. Now, of course, in most of human history, when we had to communicate face-to-face with people, you might be able to say whatever you want to me freely, but I also might be freely allowed to punch your teeth out if I don't like what you're saying. So there's always been consequences for speech. There will always be consequences for speech. And that's a different story altogether from what free speech is. So ultimately, here's the issue too. An old man says, "I'd be buried in Georgia if I could have my way, but it's a far piece to Georgia and nobody's gonna tote me. So I'll be buried up here in this cold," he added. "I don't like this cold. Of course they say when you're dead that temperature don't concern you, but who knows the truth on that?" "I don't," Cal said. "People got opinions. That's all they've got," the old man grumbled. "If someone was to go and come back, now that's an opinion I'd listen to. And that's all we've got. We've got opinions. Who really knows anything about anything? I would much prefer it if most people's opinions were based on science, based on the logical facts that we do know, and that stand as our truth for now until new scientific evidence perhaps creates new truth. At least Gus here admits to being wrong a lot of the time. Once again, poor Captain Call is having to have a conversation with Augustus. Augustus is talking. "You've got a name," Augustus said. "Doesn't it matter to you whether people use it?" "Not much," Call said. "No, I guess it wouldn't," Augustus said. "You're so sure you're right, it doesn't matter to you whether people talk to you at all. I'm glad I've been wrong enough to keep in practice." "Why would you want to keep in practice being wrong?" Call asked. "I think it would be something you'd try to avoid." "You can't avoid it. You've got to learn to handle it," Augustus said. "If you only come face to face with your own mistakes once or twice in your life, it's bound to be extra painful. I face mine every day. That way, they ain't usually much worse than a dry shave." I love that. Just the admittance that we're probably wrong most of the time. Here's another great bit of wisdom coming from Gus. He's talking to July, who is desirous of avenging some deaths. And Augustus said, "Son, this is a sad thing," Augustus said. "Loss of life always is, but the life is lost for good. Don't you go attempting vengeance. You've got more urgent business. If I ever run into Blue Duck, I'll kill him. But if I don't, someone else will. He's big and mean, but sooner or later he'll meet someone bigger and meaner. Or a snake will bite him, or a horse will fall on him, or he'll get hung, or one of his renegades will shoot him in the back, or he'll just get old and die." He went over and tightened the girth on his saddle. "Don't be trying to give back pain for pain," he said. "You can't get even measures in business like this. You best go find your wife." Such great stuff about breaking cycles of violence. Here's a wonderful, beautiful statement about music, and we're back to that cook named Po Campo, and it says, "Sometimes Po Campo sang in Spanish. He had a low, throaty voice that always seemed like it was about to die for lack of breath. The songs bothered some of the men, they were so sad." "Po, you're a jolly fellow. How come you only sing about death?" Soupy asked. Po had a little rattle made from a gourd, and he shook it when he sang. The rattle, plus his low, throaty voice, made a curious effect. The sound can make the hairs stand upon P.I.'s neck. "That's right, Po. You do sing sad for a happy man," P.I. observed once, as the old man shook his gourd. "I don't sing about myself," Campo said. "I sing about life. I am happy, but life is sad. The songs don't belong to me." "Well, you sing them. Who do they belong to?" P asked. "They belong to those who hear them," Po said. "Don't give none of them to me," P.I. said. "They're too sad. I'll get them nervous dreams." "If you hear them, they belong to you," Po said. Pretty cool stuff there. The last few things are some great thoughts on life and death in general. In this conversation, Gus is talking to Lorena, and Lorena has had this dream for a long time to go to San Francisco and leave her life at the whorehouse behind. And she has this dream that San Francisco will just change her life for the better. And Gus says to her, "Life in San Francisco is still just life. If you want one thing too much, it's likely to be a disappointment. The healthy way is to learn to like the everyday things, like soft beds and buttermilk and feisty gentlemen." Oh, that's so true. We spend so much of our energies just thinking, oh, when I have a bit more money, things are going to be so much better. Or when the holidays come, I'm finally going to be able to relax and enjoy myself and have a great time. But in the meantime, we're missing all the little good things in our lives, not appreciating the moment as much as we should. And this kind of carries on with that thought. We have Po Campo again, the one who refuses to ride animals, and instead he walks everywhere, and he's talking to young Newt. "I like to walk slow," Po Campo said. "If I walk too fast, I might miss something." "There ain't much to miss around here," Newt said. "Just grass." "But grass is interesting," the old man said. "It's like my serape, only it's the earth it covers. It covers everything, and one day it will cover me." So along with just living in the moment, I think another big thing that affects us negatively in our lives is our rush to always be on to the next thing. And we have this thought about that. Here, July is talking to a character who says, "It may be we'll meet down the road," July said, ignoring the offer. "Perhaps," Mr. Sedgwick said. "I see you're in a hurry to get someplace. It's a great mistake to hurry." "Why?" Joe asked, puzzled by almost everything the traveler said. "Because the grave's our destination," Mr. Sedgwick said. "Those who hurry usually get to it quicker than those who take their time. Now me, I travel, and when I'll get anywhere is anybody's guess. If you two hadn't come along, I'd have likely stood there in the river for another hour or two. The moving waters are ever a beautiful sight." Mr. Sedgwick turned and walked down the riverbank without another word. Yeah, so 2 keys to peace, I think, are living slowly, appreciating the little things in the moment. If only that was as easy as it sounds. Speaking of living slowly, this made me smile too. And as a reader, you'll probably appreciate this. The man looked at them sternly through his glasses. Joe, who had hated what little schooling he'd had, was at a loss to know why a grown man would sit around and read on a pretty day. None of us would do that, would we? I mean, yeah, on the one hand, it's a great way to live slowly and enjoy the moment. On the other hand, it's a reminder that, you know, today is actually quite a nice sunny day. I should probably go outside for a little while. And then let's bring death into the picture to wrap it up for us. Gus has had to go off on a little side quest, as it were, and Call is worried about Gus and is kind of regretting the fact that they had argued again when Gus was leaving. They had not had much of a talk before Gus left. Nothing much had been said. He began to wish that somehow things could have been rounded off a little better. Of course, he knew death was no respecter. People just dropped when they dropped, whether they had rounded things off or not. And isn't that what people always say when they have these near-death experiences? I just wish I'd told my loved ones that I love them. Because you just never know what is going to happen and when it's going to happen. And because of that, we'll give Augustus the last word as he chats once again with Captain Call. "Would you have wanted to settle in Lonesome Dove?" Augustus asks. "Maggie done it, and look how long she lasted." "She might have died any place," Call said. "I'll die someplace, and so will you. It might not be no better place than Lonesome Dove." "It ain't dying I'm talking about. It's living," Augustus said. "I doubt it matters where you die, but it matters where you live." You know, death really does give life meaning, and a lot of people worry about what, if anything, happens after death, but what they should be doing is just enjoying the life they have, because for all we know, that's all we've got. He says, as he's sick and just trying to get through this video because I'm in so much agony. Well, let's wrap things up with the rating. I talked about a lot of things that I enjoyed a great deal about the book, and I was waffling a bit, going back and forth between a 9 out of 10 and a 9.5 out of 10 for the rating. But as I sit here, God, I am sick here. As I sit here thinking about the fact that I didn't really mention any negatives about the book, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what didn't I enjoy about the book? What things might knock its rating a little bit? And I can't honestly come up with much. I had written down 9 out of 10 as my rating in my notes here, but the only slight negatives I can say about the book are sometimes, like I said, the pacing of the plot can be slow at times. It is quite a tragic story. Like I said, characters drop left, right, and center. So it's not necessarily a feel-good book. It's more a book about life, and life often doesn't feel good. So I think at the end of all this, I'm going to actually go with a 9.5 out of 10 for my rating of Lonesome Dove. I just think it's a remarkable work. I looked into the fact that there were other books in the series. Now, there are 4 books in a series that covers the same characters. I think the 4 books cover quite a lot of years. Although this was the first book that was actually written in the 4-book series, chronologically it's the 3rd book in the series. There are 2 books that are kind of prequels to the story, then this book, then another one that follows this one. However, I think the one that follows this one doesn't follow the characters in this book. So from what I've read, I don't think I'm going to seek out any of the other 4 books. This book stands so very well on its own. I hate to kind of ruin the experience by either going way back in time to the early years of Gus and Call here, or jumping forward in time and being left wondering what's happened to some of the characters that were left behind in this book. It sits well on its own, and I think I'm going to leave it at that. It's also time that I left this review at that. Please get into the comments, let me know what you've been reading. If you've read Lonesome Dove, I'd love to hear what you think about it. If you have read anything that has been particularly striking for you, that you've enjoyed a lot, or has impacted in you in some way, please do let me know about it. I love hearing from you. And I really love the fact that you're still here watching this. Thanks for being here with me today as I struggle through this review. Cheers. If a book is a great book, then give me more. I've been very ill with gastroenterology, nor have I read any of George R.R. Martin. I will finally here say that and give them everything that, in his case, it had led to, when that